So today I want to talk about a very fundamental musical shape, a very basic musical thing that if you are even not one who has studied a whole lot of music in depth, you are probably familiar with the concept of chords, but maybe not so familiar with the more narrow concept of triads, with the also very important and very general concept in music, voices. So today's lecture, after we define a couple of other very basic musical terms like melody, like lines, a melody line, a bass line, like voices, and then finally triads. So the piece you heard at the very beginning is Brahms' Romanze from Opus 118, the Klavierstück, which are a bunch of piano pieces. And this is, I think, a very nice example where we can see some of our triads deployed in music. Once we learn what the basic shape of the triads is, we can see how they get spelled out and played out and stretched out and spread out over the course of a piece in all kinds of interesting ways. So at the very beginning of this piece, you can see it opens with two pickup notes. Bum, boom. And then the first chord, the first big vertical sound that you play, all five of those notes, actually are all part of the triad that we see here. The root, F, down in the bass line, can be seen as the lowest note of the basic triad here, and you can see at the yellow line. The root F also appears at the very highest point in the melody, at the very top of the chord. So you've got the root encapsulating this chord doubled up so that the root is down in the bass and up in the highest voice. Then the middle of the chord, A in this case, is deployed here twice so that it is in the middle of the treble clef and at the top of the bass clef. Two A's happen in this chord as well. And finally, the triad is completed by the presence of C in that middle of the upper part. Now you can see that all three notes of the chord are present, and only those three notes are present, so that this chord articulates a big, beautiful triad. So we take that big spread out triad and we can compress it in its most simple form, just F, A, and C, as you can see there. Then we can take the F, put it down here, we can take the A and put it here and put it here, and we can take the C and put it here, and then another F up in the top. And we get the complete chord at the beginning there. Very nice. So let's define a few of these terms. Like I said, chords are things we will encounter throughout music. As you know, we've seen singular notes, just notes on their own. We've seen two notes, in other words, dyads or intervals, and we've measured all of those possible different dyads or intervals. Dyad just means two notes. But a chord is going to be anything greater than three notes or greater that then when taken together can string together and make a chord progression and even harmony. Now chords can be sounding simultaneously, as we just saw. All three notes ring at the same time and stretch out together, or they can be distributed out over time and they will still come together in our perception, in our ears. They will come together and form one whole chord. So we can see that to the right here. This is an excerpt from Mozart where the right hand takes this same chord, F, A, C, and spreads it out over the whole measure. And then in the left hand, you can see that the same chord is there too, F, C, A, C, F, C, A, C. And if I play all of it together, you can get the sense of this chord being extended out through these patterns. Through the patterns will stretch out the chord. Even the presence of other notes will not disturb the overall feeling of this chord being present if the chord's notes are the most emphasized or the most present. So I hope that makes sense, but we'll see cases in very short future where one or two notes may be around, but they don't necessarily belong to this chord. That's okay. In fact, as we'll learn, melody has a big habit of weaving in and out of chords. So speaking of melody, let's explore a little bit how melody shows up in this Brahms. Now, all of us probably have some idea what melody is. Now, melody is, usually the primary line of the composition. Most of the time that's going to be the highest voice, though not always. It'll probably contain some of the main material of the composition, such as the theme, the thematic material, or the lyrics. If someone is singing with a guitar or something, that is obviously the melody. Typically this will be the highest voice, but not always, as I said. So in the case of the highest voice of the Brahms, after the initial C and the big chord, then we have this descent in the upper voice. Now look, I've traced it out in blue. F, E, D, C, B flat, A, G, F. So the melody here actually forms a very nice scale, which is sort of disguised in the overall path of the piece. Let's see if we can listen to it all together. I hope you could hear the top line. I hope you could hear that top line there descending. So that may be what we consider the melody. As I said, often the melody will appear as the highest line in the composition. But as I mentioned, melody is just one of many voices that can be present in music. So when I say that melody is typically the highest voice, that implies that there are other voices going on. What exactly do I mean by voices? Well, voices are any musical line. Like, think the melody line. When people say, I'm playing the bass line, that's a voice. The bass voice, the bass line. I mean the same thing by these two terms. And of course, voices may be shaped together, multiple voices. Think of choral music. Think of choir music where you have soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. 4 different groups, 4 different voices, and 4 different lines that then can be shaped together to make chords and to make harmony, as you probably are familiar. So you can see here, I've highlighted now the bass voice in dark blue, and then the highest voice, or the soprano voice, in light blue. And then I've marked what's called an inner voice in green here, and actually another inner voice in another green here. And there's 1 or 2 notes that aren't completely included in this voices, and that's because this is piano music and you can play more than 4 voices. But it is similar in a way to how a choir works, because there is still that soprano line, that inner line, in other words, the alto line is the other one on the treble clef, and then the bass line down in the bottom, but then above that is the tenor line. So it's kind of like there are 4 voices present here with a couple of extra notes here and there. So when you think of it this way, you can start to see how the intervals between the bass and the tenor, and the intervals between the soprano and the alto, and then of course the intervals between the tenor and the alto, the intervals between the soprano and the bass, all the combinations of intervals in each vertical section are carefully shaped in order for the voices to form chords. And we will talk in the future more about voice motions and all kinds of different methods of shaping these into chords and harmony. Now, with this piece, it is interesting to mention, though. I said the melody is usually the highest line of the composition. And that might be true. It depends on how you hear this piece. There might be debate over what exactly is the melody here. Let's listen again. So what's very interesting to note about this piece is, as I said, the melody is typically the highest voice. Although, in this case, it might be debatable which one gets the real term melody in terms of having the main thematic material. Of course, we saw that the top voice is just a scale. So that's a little boring to be a melody. But take a look at this alto voice. Take a look at the second voice in the treble clef. So not the melody, but the other voice in the treble clef. That one has a lot more interesting movement, and it goes, that's a lot more interesting already than a scale. So we might say that one of these voices maybe gets the melody. Of course, that runs very parallel to the tenor voice. In fact, they're doubled there. They are exactly the same. And what this means is that line will kind of come out a little bit more than the melody, a little bit more than the bass. Maybe it is the case in this piece that the highest line and the lowest line are actually harmonizing the inner voices, that the inner voices are more important. For some music, the bass is the most important line and determines the other things. For some music, the melody is the most important line and determines the other things. Maybe for this piece, the inner voices are the most important line and are accompanied by those outer voices. As I said, voices string together and shape together to form what are called chords. And we can see chords, as we saw the very first chord, what we talked about at the beginning, then the second chord, then there's a little space there with an extra note, then the third chord and the fourth chord, all within that first measure. So you can see how the voices moving together end up forming different chords as they go. And this creates harmony. That is the very pattern of chords, or the way that the chords string together. Also, it is the harmonious combination of relationships between the voices. So it's really important to notice here that harmony is the result of both the vertical chords that go up and down, and also the horizontal lines that form those chords. And this isn't just for classical music. This goes for all types of music, guitar music, other kinds of instruments, and all kinds of genres, from popular music and jazz to R&B and blues. All kinds of genres have this in common, that they care both for vertical structures, in other words, chords. But if you're just plopping chords down, that can sometimes be a little boring, and it's a lot more interesting when the chords move together, that they move in and out of each other smoothly. Now, the smooth motion from chord to chord is created by the integrity of the musical lines, in other words, the horizontal lines. All of this is to say, remember that harmony has a vertical and a horizontal dimension, which we will see more and more as we go. Now we can arrive specifically at triads. And triads are a specific type of chord that is exactly 3 notes. So chords, I said, might be 3 notes, might be 4 notes, might be 5 notes, 3 or greater, but triads specifically try 3, just like dyads were our intervals, those were 2 notes. Triads are 3 notes. And triads contain a root, a third, and a fifth. In their basic form, which is called root position, they are made up of 2 stacked thirds. Thinking to our intervals now, with 3 notes, we're going to have a third from F to A there, and a third from A to C. So those are the stacked thirds, making a root, a third above it, and a fifth. Think of the scale. If this is the root note of the scale, then you could have F, G, A, B flat, C. Let's take a look at some types of triads. Now, just like intervals, we're going to have different qualities of triads. The major triad, the first one we see here, is going to be the major sounding triad, the one that evokes the major scale for us. And in this case, C major, we just take the first 5 notes of the scale and we skip 2 and 4, so we get 1, 3, and 5, root, third, and fifth. And there's your major triad. Now let's take a look at a minor triad. A minor triad would remind us of C minor. So that's going to sound more minor. Now remember, this actually calls back, because the very difference between major and minor, as we discussed, mostly is going to depend on how that third is working relative to the root. So where C goes up to E natural, you see here we have a major chord, and where C goes up to E flat, only a minor chord. Think of your scales, C major and C minor. Now take a look at the third one, the diminished triad. The diminished triad is going to be a very crunched sound. Let's take a look. So here was the major, here was minor, and here is diminished, where G also becomes flat. And then there's going to be another option where instead of G becoming flat, G will become sharp and E will become natural. So the augmented triad is like major, but with a sharp G or a sharp fifth. And the diminished triad is like minor, but with a flat fifth. So here's the augmented triad. And we're going to use these symbols you can see here up in red. Diminished triad will be notated with a little circle, and the augmented triad will be notated with a plus. So we'll see that. Here are all four in order. Actually, I'll go back to major here, and then to augmented. Okay, now let's take a look at our intervals in here, because as I said, in their root position or in their most basic form, these triads will be made up of two stacked thirds. All of them are two stacked thirds. You can see that there. So what kind of thirds though? These are not all equal thirds. For example, a major triad has a major third, but it also has a minor third. It's not two major thirds. So if we measure up from C to E, we do know that C to E is a major third, because that is the root to the third of the C major scale, so it must be a major third. But we also have learned that from E to G is actually a minor third, because this is scale degrees 5 and 3. Think back to the intervals. This is our millennial whoop, if you will. So this would be, remember, a minor third, E to G. So the major triad, the thing to remember is the major triad is made up of a major third on the bottom and a minor third on the top. And then the minor triad is made up of a minor third on the bottom, think back to your C minor scale, and a major third on the top. And then the diminished triad is two minor thirds. And the augmented triad is two major thirds. So now maybe you can see a little better why this four triads are the four basic types of triads that we'll encounter. These are all of them actually, because these are all the possibilities of the arrangements of the thirds within this shape. Now let's take a look, because when you have three notes, you don't just have two intervals. You don't just have the intervals between the first two and the second two, but you also have the interval between the root and the fifth. So what would that be? Now, most of them are going to be perfect fifths. As we know from C to G, that's a perfect fifth. And then you put your third in there, and if it's the major third from C, you get the major triad, and if it's the minor third from C, you get the minor triad. But both of them contain the C to G perfect fifth. Then with the diminished triad, you'll notice two minor thirds stacked on top of each other result in actually a diminished fifth from C to G flat. That is our diminished fifth. And then in the augmented triad, it's just the opposite. You have two major thirds together, which together form an augmented fifth from C to G sharp. So that is how to measure the intervals of the root position, or the most basic form of our types of triad. Now let's take a look at triads on the scale, because if we take our scale degrees, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we put and build triads, in other words, we stack thirds on top of each scale degree, on top of each one in the C major scale, you can see the root note, the bottom note is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. In other words, the C major scale. If we start to figure out what is the quality of each of these chords, we already have learned the first one is C major. That is a major chord, C major. But what would the next one be? Now the root is now D, the third is F, and the fifth is A. Now, without measuring each interval in depth, I wonder if you can hear the difference. Here's a major chord. Here is the chord on the second scale degree in major. Now this one, maybe you can hear, but this one is minor. This one, D to F, minor third, F to A, major third. In other words, D to A, perfect fifth, and overall, a minor triad. What about the third one? Okay, so we've got major, minor, now the third one. E to G, G to B. So this one also sounds minor, but if we want to be doubly sure, if we want to double check, we can notice that, hey, look, E to G, the root to the third of this chord, number 3, the root to the third, E to G, is a minor third. And we know that it must be because we already measured in the major chord, C to E to G, that this one was a major third and this one was a minor third. So then if we build a chord here, that's starting on a minor third and then having a major third on top, which makes a perfect fifth and a minor triad overall. Then with the fourth one, F to A to C, it's a similar process because we've already seen F to A in the D minor chord. F to A was a major third, so F, A, C is a major third plus a minor third equals a major triad. And then the fifth scale degree gets this chord, which is another major triad. And the sixth scale degree gets this chord, which is minor. Now let's take a look at the seventh scale degree. If I build that chord, now look at the outer notes of this chord. Look at the root and the fifth. B and F. I'm on number 7. B and F is, we already know, a diminished fifth just because of the way the keyboard is laid out. In other words, B to D is a minor third and D to F is another minor third. Overall, this chord is diminished. And this is our first one that we've seen, which is diminished. 2 minor thirds makes a diminished chord. And finally, the last one, which is C, E, G again, is obviously major. Just to show you that on the keyboard, let me play them again and I'll demonstrate. So C, E, G, D, E, F, C, E, G, D, F, A, E, G, B, F, A, C, G, B, D, A, C, E, B, D, F, this is our diminished one, and then C, E, G again, back to major. Right, so look, major third, minor third, minor third, major third, minor third, major third, major third, minor third, major third, minor third, minor third, major third, minor third, minor third, diminished fifth, and then major third. And that is all of the triads on the C major scale. And I think it's good to get used to this pattern that we see from how the chords emerge naturally in the scale. I haven't altered any of these notes, no sharps and flats. The order of chord qualities in the scale goes major for 1, minor for 2, minor for 3, major for 4, major for 5, minor for 6, diminished for 7, diminished for the leading tone chord, and then major again for 8. Because 8 is the same as 1, so you've just wrapped back around then. Now this is a very important pattern to memorize, and you may already see how you can extract from this or extrapolate from this how to get the minor pattern. Because if you just start on scale degree 6, then count minor, then diminished, then major, then minor, then major, and then you're back to your 1. So you can start on scale degree 6, you'll get the same pattern of chords in A minor, but just shifted over, so you're starting on scale degree 6. And these are what are called the Roman numerals for these chords. Roman numerals are our way of numbering the chords on the scale. So basically they're the scale degrees, but because they're in Roman numeral form, not Arabic numerals like 1, 2, 3, they're in the big I, 2 I's, 3 I's. The Roman numerals indicate triads. Roman numerals indicate chords. So that's a quick easy way for music theorists to communicate, like this is the, say, the 4 chord. You would write IV, in other words, Roman numeral 4, to indicate the major chord on the 4th scale degree, or the chord on the 4th scale degree, basically. It could be major, it could be minor, sorry. So it's the 4 chord. If we were in minor, the 4 chord would be minor. So we'll take a look at more at triads in minor shortly, but this pattern where chords 1, 4, and 5 are major, chords 2, 3, 6 are minor, and 7 is diminished, is, like I said, going to be crucial to remember. And we'll write capital Roman numerals for the major ones. As you can see there, 1, 4, and 5 are major, and then lowercase Roman numerals for the minor, 2, 3, 6 are minor, and then for 7, it's minor, but it also has a circle. That would mean it's diminished. Good, so that was these Roman numerals derived from the scale. And as I said, they are named after their scale degrees, and these are the actual triad names of these chords. which correspond to the Roman numerals. So for music theorists, you can go back and forth. It doesn't really matter if you want to analyze the piece by just writing C major or D minor or E minor or F major. Most people will understand that you mean an F major chord there. Or if you want to write in Roman numerals, this is kind of the more old-fashioned music theory way, then you can use that, and people will know, depending on the key that you're in, that you are correctly identifying those chords and showing how those scale degrees relate to the key that you're in. Now, a couple of important terms that we've already come across. Tonic doesn't just apply to the first note of the scale, but applies to the first whole chord of the scale. In C major, the tonic harmony, the tonic chord is this. It's the whole triad, so that you can get the essence of C major just from that. You don't need the whole scale. So that's too many notes. You don't need it. It's very much boiled down, simplified to just say, here's some C major for you. Okay? Then in a key, we know that there was tonic and there was dominant, and the dominant was 5. So 5 and 1. And the dominant chord is just that. It's the chord rooted on 5. So if I play that, then I play the tonic. There you go. 1, 5, 1. Your tonic, dominant, tonic relationship. You might hear every now and then these other terms for the names of the chords as well. And it's good to just know them. I will be on tonic and dominant using these terms a lot, and leading tone as well, because the leading tone chord is right there based on the leading tone, as we've talked about before. Now the other chords are also named. So the second chord could be called the supertonic, and this is in any key. The tonic is the root chord. The chord on scale degree 2 is the supertonic. The chord on scale degree 3 is the median. The chord on scale degree 4 is the subdominant. Now, by the way, supertonic, super is just meaning above. So the second the chord rooted on scale degree 2 is just above the tonic. Then the subdominant, you know, it's the same logic. That's the chord that is just one step below on scale degree 4, the dominant. That's the subdominant under the dominant. The mediant, number 3, is the mediating chord between 1 and 5. So you've got chords 1 and 5, and then you've got 3 in the middle. So if you think of the one chord, root, third, and fifth, then you can spell those 3 chords out. The one chord is C, E, G. The chord on 3 then is E, G, B, the mediant chord, and the chord on 5 is G, B, D, so that the mediant chord is right there in the middle of 1 and 5. Then 6 is the submediant. It's kind of the undermediant. So if you're going down from tonic to the subdominant, for example, then on your way you'll go through the undermediant, which is the chord rooted on scale degree 6. So good. With all that interesting knowledge on triads on the scale, we can then return to the Brahms and see if we can do a little bit of analyzing triads with Roman numerals. And this example is a little bit more complex than the examples I'm going to give you in the homework and all that. And I just want to give a more complicated example here in order to show you how this process really goes, even though I'm going to start you guys more going step by step. But here's what the basic steps are. So number 1 is determine the key. And as we kind of already saw, we might ask ourselves, what is the relative major minor pair that this key signature says? Well, the key signature is 1 flat, B flat. So the relative major minor pair is F major or D minor in this case. And then you might ask, well, okay, so how do I know which one is which? This really comes down to those patterns of emphasis. As I say here, look for instances of tonics and dominants in both keys. Decide which one is more present or which one is more emphasized. In other words, which one is right there at the beginning or which one is right there at the end. Now, in this case, we don't have the full piece. All we have is the beginning, but the beginning is enough. So we're looking for tonics and dominants in F major. That would be F and C, as you see in the top corner there. Or in D minor, that would be D and A, dominant being A of D. And as we saw, the tonic F major scale already does appear at the top voice, and it gives us the whole scale right away. So even if individual chords are changing qualities underneath that scale, and it doesn't necessarily sound altogether like a big F major scale, we might still say that that is a pretty important indicator. Other indicators are these. The dominant and tonic right at the beginning start this piece off. So the dominant is the 2 C's at the very beginning, and then they stretch out right away into the big tonic chord. And then you have this appearance of tonic down here and tonic up here to start your scale descending. So that is the essence of determining the key, is really just looking for how does it begin, how does it end, where are the relevant tonics and dominants, and how does that let me know which it is of the two possible ones that the key signature said. That is the way of looking at the way of doing it without actually being able to hear the piece and telling is this piece in minor or is this piece in major, which can be tricky. So the next step is step 2, is analyze the scale degrees of the bass line. As I said, we're going to want to figure out what the roots of these chords are, how they are built up above the scale degrees of the root. So in this case, all of those root notes will appear in the bass line, and we just need to map out what are the scale degrees of the bass line in order to find these chords. So we can do that pretty easily. The first one is 5. I left it out. Then starting at measure 1, we go in the bass. 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, 4, 1. Let's hear it too. 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, 4, 1. 2, 6, 2, 6, 5, 1. You can guess the next note, actually, it does return to 1 after all the way on the right, after the last chord. If we hear that with the melody, you might be able to pick out now, just try to listen for the bass line and pick it out amongst the other voices. So we have... If I just play the bass and the melody voice, you can kind of hear... Now for step 3, I'm going to move into dark mode because this got a little messy when the white score was up there. But then we're going to look to see if the scale degrees of the bass line correspond to chords above them. So correspond to vertical simultaneous chords above the bass. If we look at that first chord, when 1 comes into the bass, sure enough, there's a chord there. Sounds like that. Then the second chord, here's scale degree 5 in the bass, and then we have this chord. Then we have this moving note. Don't worry about it for now. Then the third chord on scale degree 6 in the bass makes this chord. Then the fourth chord on scale degree 3 in the bass makes this chord. Then there's another moving note. Don't worry about that moving note. Then the then the fifth chord starts on scale degree 4 in the bass and has a moving note in it too. So we'll come back to that inner voice. That note does not belong in this chord. So that is a non-chord tone, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then, what is this now? 6th chord with root note 1 in the bass, F back in the bass, and then these other notes. And it turns out that this chord is just like the first chord, but different spelling. So that was the first chord, and then we had this chord. So pretty similar. Then the 7th chord has root note 2 in the bass, and the rest of it sounds like this. Then the 8th chord has root note 6 in the bass, here it is, and sounds like this. Then don't worry about that chord in red, which scale degree 2 in the bass. We will come back to this chord, but I'm not going to worry about it today. Just pretend that this continues on that 9th chord with 6 in the bass. Comes back there. And then the last chord with 5 in the bass. Like that. So we can kind of compress all of the notes into their vertical formations. I hope you can see in the purple boxes, I'm compressing all of these notes together and making one triad out of each one. But some notes are, you can see there are some connecting notes, some moving notes, and one chord I kind of ignored altogether. So let's get a little bit more. Remember that I mentioned that these moving notes are what are called non-chord tones. And those are, non-chord tones are just notes that transition between chords or decorate chords. Think of what I said earlier about how a melody flows in and out of the harmony. It may sing with the chord or it may sing out of the chord. And non-chord tones are just those that are not part of the currently sounding triad. So the best example is right there in the middle with the 2 chords built on scale degree 4. After we get there, but then it moves through that note. And now just take my word for it today that this is a non-chord tone, and we'll analyze the notes around the note that is in the red circle there. But in the future, after you've done step 3, you may come back and say, oh, now I realize that this is a non-chord tone. Let's take a look together at step 3 and see how then we can figure out exactly how we can tell which notes are in the chord and which notes are not in the chord. Okay? So once we've found the scale degrees of the bass, then we can start to take all of those purple circles that were in the last example and make what is called a reduction. So I say make a reduction. And a reduction is a simplified version of the chord progression that reduces the triads to their simplest form. So if I take the first chord, F, A, C, A, C, A, C, and F in the top voice, that, as we already saw in the very first example, is just this chord, F, A, C, but spread out. Then the second example, if I take that chord rooted on scale degree 5, C, G in the left hand, and then G, C, E in the right hand. Let me show you on the piano, actually. If I take that second chord rooted on scale degree 5, and I start in the left hand, C and G, and then in the right hand, G and C and E, then I can reduce that by saying, well, C and G and G, well, G is redundant, so I'll just put that G back down there, C and G. Then C again, well, I already have C, that's good. And then E is there, so I add E in the middle. And then, I have the most basic form of the chord. So you just have to ask yourself, like, am I repeating notes, or have I found a new note? Then once you have that full chord there, C, E, G, you notice that there is a moving note. The moving note is A. So we are not going to worry about the A right now because it doesn't fit into the triad. We've already found the triad. It's C, E, G. The third chord, rooted on scale degree 6, has D and F, and then has and then has F, A, D in the right hand. So if we take D and F and A and D, and we do the same kind of reducing process, we can say, well, we're starting on D and we're going to F, so that's a good start. So let's see, do we have a new note? F up here, we had F down here already, so that's not a new note, so we're good. What about A? A is a new note. Okay, let's put A down here, and then D. D is already there, so now we have DFA. DFA, well, we've seen that before. That is a triad. So that is our reduction there, which for that third chord rooted on scale degree 6 starts on D, then goes to F, and then A. Then the fourth chord, and you can see how this process is going. So the fourth chord rooted on scale degree 3 there has A in the bass, and then E again, so we can leave that out already, and then A again, so we can leave that out already, and then C. So now we have A and C and E in that chord, just spread out, and some of them are double. Then there's a moving note, A, C, E moves to F, which don't worry about for now because the F doesn't belong already in this chord that we already found vertically, A, C, E. The last one I'll talk about for now in depth, because you can already see that the reduction is there above, is in measure 2, the first chord of measure 2, rooted on scale degree 4, B flat, D, F, B flat. Okay, so maybe this is sounding familiar, but all I need to do is, okay, starting on B flat, then I go to D, then do I have D again? Okay, well that's D again. Then F. F is a new one, okay. And then B flat again. Okay, well B flat is the same as the first one. So my basic triad here is B flat, D, F. Then what about the moving note? B flat, D, F, then has E, D. So you remember that from the piece, right? When it goes... So here, B flat, this chord is already reigning, the B flat major chord. So it's already there. Then the E comes in, the E natural, this note, which doesn't belong in this chord. It just doesn't belong. So I know to circle that in red, because then it goes from F through E back to D, which completes the chord again, and then changes chord back to what's called the 1 chord, or the chord rooted on scale degree 1, which, as we see there, has F, A, and C again in it. Okay, so now we can start to see how the first chord is the chord rooted on scale degree 1. That is the 1 chord. The second chord is the chord rooted on scale degree 5. That is the 5 chord. The third chord is the chord rooted on scale degree 6. That is the 6 chord, etc., etc. So in this case, it turns out that all the chords, except the one I marked in red circle there, are in root position, in which case it means that their roots are in the bass line. We know that these chords, the scale degrees of the bass line as their chord names, and we can kind of see that when we apply the Roman numerals. We know that the Roman numerals based on the scale degrees of the roots. So in this case, we will see that the 1 chord goes to the 5 chord, then there's the 6 chord, the 3 chord, then 4 chord, and the 4 chord is extended through the non-chord tone. Then it goes back to the 1 chord, then 2, then 6. 6 is stretched out through the red circled one, don't worry about it, and then to the 5 chord. And as you can guess, the next chord, it returns to the 1. So if I play back and forth, let me play both the piece again as a whole and then the reduction, so you can hear how the reduction is capturing something of the essence of the harmony, but losing so much. Let's take a listen. Resolve back to, that was the 5 chord there. Compare that to this. So maybe you can hear the similarities, right? I tried to kind of play it in the same rhythm, but of course the reduction just shows us so much more clearly how we have the chord rooted on scale degree 1, followed the chord rooted on scale degree 5, followed by the chord rooted on scale degree 6, and so on and so on. So that is basically the process of how to determine the Roman numerals or how to analyze the chords in a piece of music like this. You start by just figuring out what your key is, and then you're going to use the scale degrees from that key to analyze the bass line. And then you're going to determine if the chords are in root position, basically meaning if their roots are, yes, indeed in the bass, as is the case here, then we can name all the chords just based on their scale degrees of the bass line. 1, 5, 6, 3, 4, 1, 2, 6, 5, etc. And as we'll see going forward, getting used to not only the chord names, but also the Roman numerals will allow us to see common patterns, allow us to see, yes, in fact, the 1 chord and the 5 chord show up much more commonly than other chords, at least in this style of music. And then what I mean by patterns is we'll see common harmonic sequences, otherwise known as common chord progressions, that will use these Roman numerals, but in any key. So the way to see that they are all connected is not that this is the C, the F, the A, the B chord, but to see that this is the 1, the 4, the 5, and the 1 chord, or something like that. That pattern that will appear over and over, that we can see appearing over and over again in different kinds of music, and understand more about the nature of harmony.